Welcome to our platform series with Andre and Julian. In our last video, we clarified what platform businesses are. And in this video, we will explore one of the three methods to move from a product linear business to a platform business. Turning product into platform is fundamentally about extending those products to also enable interactions between external entities, be it customers and/or third parties. So let's set the context. Who will benefit from this, and why should any successful product or service business consider moving to a platform business?
Actually, there's sort of three categories. One is established firms who have a strong customer base. The second one would be thinking about startups, thinking about how they're going to develop. They should think about this move to becoming a platform because potentially that can add a lot of value and a lot of investor interest. And then the third would be actually existing platforms. I think there's something to learn from this in terms of how they can open up a new side or new side of their multi-sided platform business.
Everyone should consider, any company of any size should at least consider the possibility of turning their products or services into platforms. In many cases, that will actually lead to something tangible. And if not, even if the company decides, okay, well, we'll stick to doing products and services, it will have been a very useful exercise, and at least we'll have generated some interesting ideas. But at this point, given the experience that Julian and I have working with like different companies of all sizes, can take pretty much any product or service. There's always some interesting twists and some interesting way to turn it productively, at least partially, into a platform.
That doesn't mean that the firm in the end will want to do that, but at least this potential, right? In most cases, there's potential to turn their business into a platform, and then they can evaluate the benefits and the costs and see whether that makes sense.
As part of the flywheel strategy to look at what is next as the flywheel to turn for a product company, exploring and looking into whether a platform business should be a potential growth engine for the next flywheel turn. That could be also how they could apply it.
If I start as a platform from scratch, it's very difficult because I typically have to attract two sides, buyers and sellers. Versus this one, the whole point of turning a product into a platform, well, you already have to have a product, right? So you already have something. So you're not starting from scratch.
Yeah, you can almost see this as a strategy that a startup might use. They want to become a platform, that's their plan, but they sell a product first to get the core customer group, and then later attract the third party, who want to access these customers. So, it could be part of a startup execution plan. Go to product first, then become a platform later.
Being a successful product is really difficult now to go for the route via a product and then a platform.
Being a successful platform is even more difficult. You got two sides to get on simultaneously.
Important to add. So why should, pretty much like we said, any company consider this? In short, it's fear and greed. So I got this from a company I work with. The fear part is the idea that by becoming a platform, your product or service will actually become more defensible against competitors. And we can talk about why. And the greed part is simply that if you become a platform, you start generating network effects. You're more likely to grow faster, and you can sometimes generate new revenue streams that otherwise you wouldn't have had.
Yeah, and all the things we talked about previously when we were talking about, why become a platform, what is a platform, all the benefits that you get from being a platform, they will apply here, of course, which is, really comes into the greed part.
Let's look at what is the one way that you can turn a product and linear business to a platform business.
Sure. So today we'll talk about the first methodology for turning a product into a platform, and we call that one opening the door to third parties. And this is by far the most commonly known or commonly used method for turning products into platforms. And the idea is very simple. Suppose you have a product and you have a decent enough customer base, like a pretty large customer base, that is somehow attractive to some third-party providers of products and services. So the idea here is to allow these third parties to offer, or at least to advertise their products and services within your product. So you're opening your product or your service to other third parties to come in and offer their wares. And just to make things tangible, there's lots of successful examples of this. Perhaps the one that everyone understands is the iPhone. It may be, perhaps this is like long ago, it's 2007. perhaps a forgotten story. Apple, when they first released the iPhone, they wanted the iPhone to be a standalone Apple product. So Apple hardware and only Apple software. It took them about a year until they realized there were a lot of third-party software developers that were dying to develop third-party apps. But initially, Apple was very reluctant to allow the third parties. Eventually, they realized there's a lot of potential, there's a lot of value for their customers to allow these third parties to provide apps on the iPhone. And of course, they never looked back since, and it's become a very, very successful product, a successful platform.
When you're thinking about opening up to these third parties to offer products or services or to advertise to your customers, you could. Often this is because these other third parties have complementary products or services. So in the case of the iPhone, they were producing apps that Apple didn't have or weren't thinking about having. But other times it's also, in the more interesting case, is actually these third parties are offering substitute or competing products or services to the ones that the original firm is already selling. And that makes the whole question more interesting. Like, does Apple want to open up the iPhone to allowing apps that are competing with its own apps? And I think, the answer we would give is usually yes. And the reason for that is, while on the one hand, it does cannibalize sales of their own apps, more importantly, it increases demand for the underlying core product, which is the iPhone. And that generates more users of the iPhone, attracts more third-party app developers, and that grows the whole ecosystem.
I think this is one where a lot of companies get hung up on. It's like, oh, if we open to third parties, what if our competitors want to come in? And again, the default option should be allow them in. You're much better off having these somewhat competing third-party products and services actually add value to your customers rather than going off and competing with you somehow. So in the case of the iPhone, well, if you shut out, say, a third-party app that competes with functionality you already have, well, they'll go to Google, to Android, right? I mean, it's much better that they're present and actually add value to your customers, and you'll deal with some disruption.
What are some other examples of matured companies that have actually used this method?
Sort of the ones that people would probably know about. Think companies like Zoom, Wix, Shopify, Amazon Web Services. A lot of software companies, they have a core customer group. Those customers are using their software for a particular purpose, but there's many other sort of add-on functionalities that they can't provide themselves, and they then invite these third-party developers to develop for their customers. So if you think about Amazon Web Services, which was started at around 2002, I think, they were just providing cloud services to their business customers, right, for a long time, and they're doing it all themselves. But then there's various software that those customers wanted to use that they were not providing. And so they opened up to, basically a marketplace for all these other software developers to provide software on top that works on top of Amazon Web Services. And that's a big marketplace now.
Every major software product or service that you can think of has probably been turned into a platform at some point by opening up to third parties, having this kind of marketplace. So in addition to the examples that Julian mentioned, Salesforce has done the same thing. Intuit, QuickBooks, Xero out of New Zealand, which is a competitor to QuickBooks, Twilio, again, all the major software products, they all at some point did exactly this. They open up to third parties. And one way to think about the benefits, again, I mean, the idea here is you're going to open up because you can't possibly offer every single functionality that every single one of your customers wants. I mean, you could, in a sense, first of all, you're probably not going to think of all of them, all the variations. And second, even if you could think of them, there's some niche, some niche functionalities that only a small segment of your customers want, that's probably not economical for you to focus on. So it's much better to just allow a third party to come in and serve those customers. So it's something called, I think, the 80-20 rule. So your product focuses on 80% functionality, and you bring in third parties to complete the remaining 20%. And again, that increases the value to your customers. Instead of you just providing a bare bones product, now you have a platform, and your customers can choose from lots of different third-party variations to customize their offering.
Yeah, maybe an example outside of software. So one in the banking sector, for instance, would be Deutsche Bank. So Deutsche Bank, obviously offers traditional banking services to its customers, and it decided deliberately to allow those customers to access third-party investment products, in particular term deposits. So when they log into their Deutsche Bank account, this is in Germany, they would see not only the Deutsche Bank, offerings of 1 year, 2 year, so on investments, but also those of all other third-party banks or financial institutions in Europe that had come onto their platform to offer competing products. So this is an example where they're all competing, right? It's not even adding complementary services. They're really just allowing all the competitors onto their own banking product, with the idea that that will attract more people to be Deutsche Bank customers, because they can always find the best rates when they come onto Deutsche Bank, and they have this choice of all the best investment products in Europe.
We know that, Andrei, you have actually worked and consulted with Quickbooks yourself, and to help them turn their product into a platform business. Would you be able to elaborate more about how they have transitioned?
Quickbooks is a pretty old product. I mean, it's a very established, 30 or 35-year-old product. And, the company was doing very well. But around, I think, at the time I worked with them, this was like around 2012, I think that the founder realize, okay, well, there are all these companies becoming platforms, and they have higher valuations. So for all the reasons that we talked about in the previous video, what makes platform businesses very successful and very defensible and very valuable. So the founder was basically, well, we should have some of that, right? And actually, that's how I started talking to him, and then he said, you should come and help us in some way to along this journey. And they basically, within 2 or 3 years, they turned Quickbooks from a very good product into what they now call the operating system for small businesses, which clearly signals is not just a product now, it's a platform. So they open up to third-party apps and third-party services that could now be enjoyed by Quickbooks customers. And they definitely, this was from day one, they were very clear that it didn't matter whether the third parties were complementary or competing. They actually made it very clear that they're completely welcoming of third-party products. They were competing with existing Quickbooks functionality.
There are interesting cases where the company will not want to allow competing third parties on there deliberately, and sometimes that could make sense from a self-interest point of view, and that's where the third party may basically compete with their underlying original product in such a way as to shift customers away from that original product.
And actually in Australia, we also have our own Atlassian that launched their marketplace in 2012 for third-party add-on for their collaboration products. And they said that they made 250 million in 5 years with 3,000 add-on. And they actually mentioned that around 50 businesses built on their marketplace have revenue over $1 million. Right.
So, by the way, I think it's useful to use this example again to come back to something we mentioned at the beginning. So, what's the point of doing this? Well, think about it from the perspective of Atlassian. So, what does that buy them? Well, the greed part is it clearly buys them a lot more additional revenue, right? Because now they can charge these third parties. And the second part is it makes it that much more defensible, because now if I'm a customer of Atlassian, it's not just the Atlassian product, but now I also have these third-party add-ons, which make it very valuable. So if someone comes along with something a little bit better than Atlassian, they don't have the third parties, I'm not going to switch.
Yes, I agree. And I actually think that it really unleashed the scale and the growth, and it really unconstrained by what you can think of what the customer need. It really allowed, as you said before, about the creativity in the platform business model. It allowed that hyper customization that you will not be able to do yourself in a very quick way. So in an old traditional industry of the industrialized cookie cutter way of growing, this really allowed that hyper growth, but in a personalized and a customized way, for individual company to actually gain the benefit from.
It's customized, and it's also very obviously cost efficient. So actually one cool quote or pearl of wisdom that I got from the founder of Intuit, he said, the reason we want to turn our product into a platform is I want my product to get better while I sleep. So this is actually I think that's very insightful. That's exactly what you're doing. So previously, if you're not a platform, well, any kind of feature improvement, you have to do the work, right? I mean, if I have to add a feature, I have to do it. Now the point is, if I open up to third parties, I'm not the one doing the work. I'm just relying on the third parties to add interesting things, and my product gets better by virtue of these third parties being creative and working very hard.
So what about the emerging product companies? How can they actually use this method as well?
I think the startups or the smaller companies, it's not that they can necessarily do this straight away, because like we said, it's important that they have a significant customer base that these third parties will want to sell to. And if they're too small, their customer base is too small, then the third parties just won't be interested in developing products and apps and so on. But it's certainly something that they should have on their roadmap, right? They should plan for this, that they know if they can attract enough users that they're going to be attractive target for third parties to develop these apps or services to sell to. So it's certainly something they should have on their roadmap. It's important to highlight to investors because they can see a bigger potential. Then this is not just going to be selling a product forever, but at some point it's going to be a platform that's going to have all these other benefits we've been talking about.
Startup that has starting to have a big enough customer base. I think we mentioned Peloton. Like right now, for example, Peloton, like their bikes and service. I think all the content of the classes is provided by Peloton itself. I see no reason why Peloton should not, like soon enough, like because they already have lots of customers, right? Surely they can open up and create a marketplace for instructors that are not employed by Peloton to offer classes via the Peloton platform.
I know one of Andrei's favorites would be Calm, which is the meditation app, right? So right now, I think they're using their own people to read, the bedtime stories and to provide the meditation guidance and so on. But they can certainly consider opening it up to, independent third parties. To basically create a marketplace to get a whole variety of third parties, which the Calm customers could select from.
Just to be clear, so there's an interesting twist on this one. So think of Calm a little bit like Netflix. There's a lot of content on Calm, which is done by, say, famous people like Matthew McConaughey or LeBron James. These people don't work for Calm, but the content itself is produced by Calm. So basically, Calm had to pay Matthew McConaughey, get him in a studio and record these production, right? So they have to pay. It's a little bit like Netflix creates their own content with like famous superstars. The problem is that that's very expensive, right? I mean, you can have some of them, it's going to be high quality, it's going to be great, but it's very expensive. If you want to grow faster, it's better, exactly what Julian said, open up a marketplace, and now you truly allow third parties. You don't have to record it, just allow third-party meditation gurus to offer whatever recordings or meditation practices they want on top of the Calm platform.
This immediately, raises sort of thinking about the benefits and costs, which I'm sure we're going to get to. But, an immediate risk of doing that, which Calm may be concerned about, is you're going to get, low quality, gurus giving their advice, which is going to give a bad experience for the users, and it's going to, damage their brand, the Calm brand, which has it has a good reputation right now. So there's definite trade-offs.
Another interesting example is a company called Formulates, which essentially provides at this point a product, and what they're trying to do is offer customers customized beauty products. So I think they started with customized shampoo. So they basically they send something to customers, they get feedback from customers, and based on that they change the chemical formula of the shampoo in order to truly customize it to individual customer tastes. Now, in order to do this, they developed a whole infrastructure, so physical infrastructure of production and customer feedback, which allows them to do this, at scale and in a cost-efficient manner. Of course, they can do some products themselves, so some customized products themselves, but they can't possibly do all the products, all the beauty products that you can think of in this way. So it is very possible for Formulates, conceivable, that they can they can open up to third parties. They want to provide other products, like beauty products, that are not offered by Formulates, but using their infrastructure, and perhaps create a marketplace, a little bit like an equivalent of the Apple App Store, Formulate App Store. In this case, would be where customers can go and find products from Formulate, but also other products from third parties, which are also customized.
One alternative which could happen, which they could do, which wouldn't make them a platform, is that instead of doing that, these third parties that want to have personalized products could use their infrastructure, could use their factory that does all the personalization and their infrastructure in terms of doing the customer surveys and getting the feedback, but just basically pay to use that service and then sell their customized products to their customers directly. In this case, they wouldn't become a marketplace, they wouldn't become a platform. And that's a reasonable alternative. So this is a case where there are different ways you could do it, one of which would turn them into a platform, because the customers would come to Formulate Marketplace or App Store to find the different customized products that they want, right? And in the second way, these customers would just come directly to these other brands and get the products directly. And these other brands are just using Formulate as a sort of production house.
Right. I think that's a very important point to realize. So this was true. I mean, this is something that can be considered for a lot of the examples we mentioned. So it was certainly something that Intuit, so QuickBooks, considered. Not necessarily with the apps, but with some of the services. So you actually, again, like Julian said, you have this choice. Like you can become a marketplace and truly connect your customers to third parties, or you can just basically rent out whatever infrastructure you have or whatever access you have. You just, sell it or rent it out to third parties, collect some revenue, but not create this like marketplace with network effects. So you get some benefits, but not all the benefits that you would get by becoming a platform.
So do you see that it's more applicable in terms of the B2C or like a B2B, but the B itself is more like a lot of SME and small business owner type of businesses that could sort of benefit more from this business model when they open up to parties to their customers, and because they need, like you said, some volume of business before they open up to be a platform. So as a product company, if you tend to sell to the SME crowd and therefore you have a lot more volume, and they are usually an underserved market, so it allows that channel and portal to address that.
I think B2B software would be the number one kind of category, right? Because you need a lot of users. You need some similarity between these users. I mean, the users should all want your core product, right? That's why they're there. And then the question is but then they have all these other different needs, this diverse range of other needs, and that creates demand for these third-party developers to come on and satisfy all those different needs. So that is sort of the perfect environment for creating a marketplace on top of a product.
Right, but I think this is this particular method, like opening up to third parties, I truly believe that it applies across the spectrum. So sure, it's probably ideal is maybe small to one, so it's B to small, medium-sized B. But honestly, it works with anything. It works with consumer products. It works with products that are targeted to large enterprises, medium size, and small businesses. I mean, I think there are definitely examples for all of these.
Right, and one example we haven't really touched on, but it does apply to a lot of B2C, would be sort of opening up to advertisers, right? Like, if I have a product which has a loyal customer base, I have customers that third parties might want to advertise to, right? So, and that applies obviously to a lot of consumer products potentially. And we see this sort of opening up to advertisers in some examples. You think about advertising on airlines, where they paint their ads on the planes and in the planes, all over the planes. You see that in taxis, advertising in and on the taxis. So these are examples where the firms are selling a product and then they have a sort of a customer base that has their fairly sticky attention. They're stuck in the airplane, they're stuck in the taxi. And so it's a good avenue to open up to advertisers to target those customers.
If you have an example of a product business and you would like to know how to turn it into a platform business, please type your questions in the comments below. And who knows, we might just pick your product as an example to walk through how you could do that. And remember the Andrei promise.
30 seconds or less or your money back.
Exactly. Let's talk about what are some of the prerequisites for a company to use this method.
So this one we mentioned earlier. The most important one is your customer base has to be large enough to be attractive to third parties. This is just not going to work if you're a small startup and you have 10 customers. It has to be like you already have a big enough and attractive enough customer base for third parties.
These customers have demands for additional products or service on top, right? Like, ideally, they're happy with your core product, but there's other things they want. And so if you think about the example of Zoom, like they're happy using Zoom. There's a lot of people who use that. It's a core product, but different people have different additional things they want to do on top of Zoom. They want to make payments. They want to use it to sell stuff, and so they want to be able to accept payments. or they're using it in education context and they want to use it to invigilate exams. So they want software or services on top of Zoom that are particularly geared to that specific use case. And that when you have lots of diverse use cases, it's not something that Zoom or the product firm can possibly satisfy all of them itself. So it's very natural to open up to third-party developers to build those.
For the technology and software companies, though, is there any specific requisite with regards to maybe even the product architecture? Because I guess some of the constraint of what do you mean by allowing access, of customer through your product? What could be some of the prerequisite for that?
I mean, this is not a prerequisite. I think what Julian mentioned. So the two prerequisites, it's what we said. It's big enough customer base, and there's some heterogeneity among the user needs, so that it makes sense to bring the third parties. Then there's the technical question: how exactly do you bring the third parties? I mean, this is something you obviously have to modify your product somehow. So typically, if it's software products, the way this is done is you open up APIs. So you open up some software gates, quote unquote, which allow these third parties to provide their products. And presumably you're going to create a marketplace. You have to allow these third parties to log into the marketplace and provide their wares. And of course, you also want to maintain some control over who and what gets offered in the marketplace.
I guess once we go outside of the software products, things can get a little bit more difficult from a technical point of view. So if you think about banking, in the Deutsche Bank example, the reason I believe they're able to do that was there's another company that built the technology that allowed the banks to open up to these other third-party financial providers. And that technology is not straightforward. It's not just a standard API, right? There's a lot of security, privacy issues in banking, and those had to all be addressed, and additionally regulatory issues as well.
So I mean, yeah, especially I guess it's this becomes an issue when the initial product is based or has access to a lot of sensitive customer data. Then you have to be very careful, because it's not just opening up the API like Julian said. You also have to decide or figure out how much of your customer data gets passed on to the third parties. Like how much customer data do the third parties have access to? And of course, you have to get the permission of your customers, and you have to be very clear, who's responsible for the data and so on.
Yeah, it's almost as if before you open up, you need to define the governance and what is the gatekeeper, the quality control, so-called, as a platform business that you need to do. How do you verify, unverify? How do you structure that in the security if it's a technology? Because all this API has holes, it's getting more and more important, from that perspective, right? But for physical business and traditional business, do you see any other maybe critical success factors instead of prerequisite that are important? I
mean, high level conceptually, I think we covered pretty much all. I mean, this is not to minimize. The execution is very important, and like Julian says, the closer you get to real world and hardware and physical infrastructure, it gets a little bit more complicated. But by the way, usually it will always require some software. Some software has to there has to be some marketplace, or some software will have to be involved.
The only point I would add on is that in these physical examples, the cost of this integration, of building the sort of marketplace, if you like, can be quite considerable, right? That could be a reason why you don't go ahead, just because it's too costly to actually build the thing, which is less likely to be an issue in the pure software digital world.
So there must be some great benefits to motivate people to actually want to move to a platform business. And so what could be some benefits of this method?
One is, of course, increasing demand for the core product, right? So as you're able to offer all these third-party services on top, that increases demand for the core product and makes that core product more defensible, grow faster, and so on. Secondly, if you create a marketplace, you can often charge commission on that marketplace or a take rate, and that gives you a new source of revenue. Okay. And thirdly, when you have all these third parties developing products on top, you might actually learn that certain products are very profitable, very successful, and you can offer those yourself. So you actually get to learn, see what other people are doing, and sometimes opportunistically, double down on those.
And finally, of course, you make your product more defensible. Like we said, the fact that now you have an ecosystem of third parties that are offering products and services on top of your product, like the example of Atlassian that you mentioned, Josephine, that makes the product a lot more defensible in the face of competitors.
The point about actually learning and incorporate it into your own offering, though, do you have any example of that? Because that just reminds me about a retailer, seeing successful product that is sold, on their shelf, and then producing their own brand product.
Yeah, well, the example that's very much in the news these days would be Amazon, right? Which has its marketplace. and was originally a reseller. So it did move from being, if you like, a reseller of books to opening up to these third parties, as a marketplace. And now when it sees, some products that are very successfully selling on its marketplace, it can obviously imitate those, copy those, and produce them itself and profit from that. So, there's an element of learning in that example.
And so what would be some of the potential pitfalls and trade-offs for this method?
You start by selling a product, right? So when you're in this product world, essentially it's all up to you. So I control the features into the product. I have full responsibility. I know exactly what's happening. When you open to third parties, now there's this issue. I'm not fully in control by definition of what the third parties are doing. However, I may be held responsible by my customers, right? So even though I'm saying, well, now my product is a platform, so you're getting stuff not just from me, but from third parties, the customer will still say, listen, I'm just buying the initial product from you. In some sense, I hold you responsible for the third parties. So that can be sometimes a tricky situation to be in, because let's say, despite your best efforts, sometimes something goes wrong and the third party screws up. Like you have this third party, they make a mistake or whatever, like their customer service is not very good. Well, that actually impacts your brand negatively, because customers will still look at you to basically resolve these problems. So there's this issue of responsibility for third party screw ups that now arises.
The platform will have to remove some of these, right, if they're problematic. And you think about Apple and the iPhone with the App Store, and of course there are apps that have been controversial and they've had to be removed, and so that's definitely a very real problem that many of these marketplaces have to deal with. If you go back to that Calm example, right, like Calm deciding whether to open up a marketplace, I think that would be very much weighing on their minds that that their customers might have a bad experience with some third-party meditation gurus and so on, and that can affect their brand value and experience. So it's a real downside. I guess the other downside would be the actual cost, right? The cost of doing this integration. And as we said, for physical businesses, those costs could be quite substantial, because they might have to actually change the physical product in a way that allows the marketplace to be built on top. If you think about a gym and wants to open up to third-party providers of cycling classes and other types of classes, well, it has to might have to reconfigure the gym layout. It might have to build some payment technology to allow these third parties to accept payment, from the users and keep track of all that. So there can be substantial costs involved with doing the integration.
Let's talk a little bit more point about allowing competitors to sell through your platform. And how should they think about this, and in what way?
So the simplest way probably to think about it is to ask, okay, competitor, and by the way, when we say competitor, that means a third party who's offering some sort of feature or product that at least partially competes with some feature that's included in your original product. So, the obvious way to look at it was how important is that feature? If they're just replacing like a peripheral feature, like something that's not very important, obviously you should let them in. And like we said, typically in most cases, you should err on the side of allowing these competitors. The way in which this starts to become dangerous is if the feature that the third party is competing with is actually truly core to the product, or if you can see a scenario in which some third party offers that feature, and from there they can build a competing product, something that competes with your entire offering. But that's generally more rare.
So an example here would be Apple and Epic and other companies wanting to create app stores that can be accessed via the App Store, the iPhone App Store. So obviously Apple's worried that if they allow competing app stores on there and customers then start getting all their games through these competing app stores, they don't need to come to the App Store anymore. And so and I think Andrei, in your experience with Intuit, I think this happened, this question came up, right? Or has sort of arisen in hindsight. Some of the companies developed in their marketplace have the potential now to sort of be competitors to the underlying original product, not just to the apps on top, but to the original underlying product.
Right, that's an interesting point. So there was one example in a case of Intuit, but honestly, even looking back, I don't think they regret it in the sense like, so the example was Square. So Square has a payment functionality which QuickBooks had, and QuickBooks basically said, we'll allow Square and get rid of our own payment functionality. And now Square has become very large. Now, I think the interesting point here is what Julian mentioned. I mean, it's actually, in order for this like third party to be truly threatening, I mean, it has to threaten the core. So in the case, it just struck me that as Julian was talking, like the way a third party could threaten the core is if, so you're allowing the third party to come in and they actually build a platform on top of your platform. That actually starts to become very dangerous, right? In the case of Intuit, it wasn't really that dangerous, but in the case of Apple, like I absolutely agree. Like if someone comes in and says, now we're going to build an app store on top of your app store, I mean, that starts to look very dangerous from the perspective of the original product or platform like Apple.
So imagine, I mean, just to make it more concrete, imagine Epic's App Store developed on top of Apple's iPhone App Store. Imagine at some point it becomes so big that everyone's using it to choose all the games they want to play, not just Epic games, but all the different games, right? All the different mobile games. And at some point, Epic can migrate all these third-party game developers and their users off the iPhone App Store and directly into their own, right? And so, this is, at that point, they've sort of shifted all these customers away from using the iPhone App Store to their own App Store in terms of at least gaming, right? And that is a large segment of all the people using, the App Store. So that's the threat, right? That you actually build on top, you create a competitor for the core product. If we go back to a very concrete example like the gym, right? It would be like you have a gym, you want to open up to a third party, so you open up to a cycling class. The cycling class becomes very popular and builds up a big customer base. And then, at some point, people actually prefer the cycling class to the gym, and they start offering all these other services that the gym was originally offering and shift people across to their own studios, which have all the gym services. This doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad to open up to third parties that are competing, as Andrei said, but it's just a risk that you have to think about. It's one of the trade-offs that if they start trying to compete for your original core users by offering the same competing core services, then potentially they can undermine the original product.
In most cases, the likelihood that someone comes along as a third party and offers something that truly threatens your core is pretty low. I mean, again, so I think it's useful to have that perspective, but obviously you should, as a company, should always consider that, should always be mindful of that. If the third parties are just basically like laboring at the edges and they're replacing some functionalities, I think you should be completely fine with that. I mean, sometimes it's just very hard to predict, but sometimes it's pretty obvious. Like, if they're taking core functionalities, then you have to be a little bit more careful.
So remember to subscribe, like, and share if you have learned something from this video. Yes, it will motivate us to share more. So do you know of any examples of companies that have sort of tried this approach and have failed, maybe struggled to implement this?
Couple that we can think through. So one of them was a gym in Atlanta. I think it's one of the first examples that we used in an article about 3 or 4 years ago. So I think this gym was called the Forum Athletic in Atlanta, and they were one of the first gyms to do this platform arrangement whereby they invited a third-party cycling studio to offer classes within their gym. So I think they did this for about a year or two, and after a year or two, the arrangement didn't work out as expected, and they ended the relationship. So they went back to offering their own cycling classes. Now, again, the issue here is like none of these companies are very open about like what exactly went wrong and what were the problems, but we suspect it probably had something to do with what Julian was mentioning, which was the cost, like just purely the having to deal with the third party studio within your gym can create frictions, right? There's branding frictions. There's the fact that you have to figure out like who owns the customer, how do you deal with the customer, how do we presumably the third party cycling studio wants to get the customers from the gym and make them sign up for membership at their other studios. And of course, the gym doesn't like that. So presumably there's a lot of frictions like this. And at some point it may become obvious the frictions are not worth the upside that we're getting from this platform relationship.
Yeah, in a physical setting like that, could actually be frictions between the different workers, right? Like the employees of the gym and these independent third-party instructors coming in, they might have had frictions because they have somewhat competing objectives and they're actually working in the same space. And that could have created a sort of hostile environment and led to breakup.
We have an Australian example for you, Josephine. So there's this financial services company called Suncor. I think they announced, this was like around 2017, they announced a great fanfare that they're turning their products or services into a platform by opening a marketplace for third-party financial products. And they made a very big deal out of it. They even hired, I think, someone specifically to deal with this. And after 2 years, they basically shut it down. Again, they haven't been very specific as to what exactly went wrong, but certainly it did not live up to the promise.
Maybe if they hire you to do that, they might not have failed.
Absolutely. Look at Intuit. Look at Intuit.
I was just thinking about Masterclass. Masterclass, they have
Yeah.
all the actors that do all the short courses. And I was just thinking to myself, that's definitely a product business model. But then if you say like open it up to anybody to provide that class, from a brand perspective as a consideration, that would definitely really cannibalize that Masterclass brand itself, because it's just a very different premium feel. But as you said, maybe they could do it in a different way, where create a different platform, a different business itself with a different brand, using the existing infrastructure and create a platform business that empower and enable the steps of how to create such videos, what you need to set up such videos, and then allow people to create the mini courses, and then maybe a different complementary unit in order to do that. What do you think?
I mean, I think in cases, this is an interesting one. So in general, it just made me think of another possible sort of like issue. If you have something, a product or service in this case, like that relies on a very strong brand, like a very specific way of doing things, which is Masterclass, all the classes are kind of very similar format. I would argue, like, I find them very boring and like very superficial, but that's whatever, that's their brand. I think opening up to third parties becomes more difficult, because then you really have to train the third parties, and to a point where like, is it really like, it's very hard to train third parties to that extent without hiring them. So then it's like, well, you might as well do your own, and it becomes very difficult to sort of extend the brand to such third parties because their brand is associated with that kind of class. By the way, I actually think it would be better because it could not be more boring than what they currently have. So,
but remember the underlying, one of the underlying reasons or situations where you want to do this product or platform move, which is where your customers have heterogeneous needs, right? And if we think about Masterclass, they're coming on there, expecting a particular type of service, right? It's not like they all have different needs and they want to sort of somewhat high quality, some happy to pay less for low quality. It's like it is pitching itself as the high quality branded class with the best instructor in the world. So I just don't think to that user group that are paying for this, it's the right way to go.
And I was thinking about Wix, where they are looking at providing all add-ons for anybody that have a website and even e-commerce capability, but also Shopify, which is also doing the same thing. But the way they entered that market is through the whole e-commerce software itself. But primarily, their customers are roughly the same, or people that have website that could be selling it or using the website in some form. Is the market sort of big enough to encompass and allow all these different niche platforms that service the same, consumer base?
Well, I think, it's certainly not winner takes all, right? Because you can have there are several competitors to Shopify, not just Wix. Well, Andrei,
there's like WooCommerce. Yeah, there's Big Commerce. There's a few of them.
There's a few, and they're doing well.
And there's so many businesses, and honestly, there's quite a lot of heterogeneity between the businesses that it definitely can support multiple competing products and even platforms.
I mean, you think about using Wix and you use Shopify, it'll be a different experience, right? Like, and that experience doesn't work for everyone. Like, they are differentiated.
By the way, Wix and Shopify are very different. Wix is just website. Shopify is a lot more than website. Shopify is like it's e-commerce backend. Like Wix does not.
I think what Josephine's saying is Wix is becoming more like Shopify. Like they're opening up e-commerce facilities. And if you think about a lot of these different software providers, they're all sort of trying to become platforms for everything. It's a bit like across a whole range of different services. They start with a particular niche, and then they try to integrate with everything else. And this is your one place where you can get all the things you need as a small business. And so there is some convergence in that. Like there's going to be many entry points for a small business. They could start with an accounting software, and now from that accounting software, they can get access to everything else they need to run their business. Or they can start with Shopify, and with Shopify, which was providing their website and their e-commerce sales, they can now get their accounting software and everything else they need to run their small business. So ultimately, I do see like there would be a number of big players that have these platforms servicing small, medium-sized businesses that provide that entry point where they can be integrated with a whole range of other services, right? The whole ecosystem. But there's still not winner takes all, because there's enough differentiation that, not everyone wants to have the Shopify service, not everyone wants to have the Intuit service, not everyone wants to have the Wix service. They're different services, they have different strengths and weaknesses.
Businesses always like to think that the customer is going to converge, on me. I always think that it's never convergent, it's always divergent. Till today, I still can't decide between Apple or Windows. I just have both, nor can I decide between, Gmail, Google, and Microsoft, so I just need to have both. So it's a bit like, do people really actually converge to one type, or actually they just increase their spend and use multiple platforms, for example?
I think they would ultimately use multiple, but they're not necessarily all going to use Wix and Shopify, right? Where they become quite close, they're not going to probably sign up to both, but they are going to have probably Shopify, and they're still going to sign up to Intuit and Twilio and Zoom and a bunch of other things, even though some of those other providers will be providing them access to, the other platforms.
Yeah, I'm just considering how would a person decide that I'm going to go with this platform and all the surrounding complementary add-on that would make sense for me, and how would I decide between this and that, in terms of the differentiation between the two, right? So that's like
I think this is what Julian said, right? I mean, they'll have like different strengths and weaknesses. I mean, yes, they all offer everything, but they can't possibly be good at like the more you converge and offer like truly like the whole suite, the more it's going to become obvious, like there's certain parts of that suite that are better like over here, and there's certain other parts that are better over there. So you'll probably pick the one like that basically excels at the things you care most about, and the other person or the other company may choose a different one if they care about different attributes.
Yeah, so, if you think about like just the user interface, right? It has to be different on each of these platforms. And people respond differently to different user interfaces. Some are more comfortable with one or another. So there's just natural differentiation.
So this is an audience question. What are the steps for a company to transition into a platform business model? How do you transition the team to such a model? Or what new skills and talent are needed to transition them?
So we talked about the strategy parts, right? I mean, like how do you do it from a strategic standpoint? Like how do you what are the different steps? The part that we haven't touched upon is like what has to change internally. I say there hasn't been a lot written about the organizational issues. I mean, I can share a little bit from my experience at Intuit, like having observed how this worked. So there's a difference between like say, okay, we identified the opportunity. There's a clear opportunity to turn this product into a platform, and we'll do it by opening up APIs to third parties. Great. Okay. How do we execute that, right? And so at Intuit, the way it was done, I thought it was very, in some sense, it was very democratic. So they had a lot of, this definitely came from the founders, a little bit like top down, but he made an effort to infuse the organizational platform thinking. And I guess bringing me on board was part of that. And, they would have like all these conferences where bring everyone in the company and sensitize everyone, like, why is it important to turn every single product that we do here? Let's try to find interesting ways to turn it into a platform. So they're truly trying to like get everyone to think about like platform issues. So that's step number one. Step number two, once you identified, okay, this is the main platform opportunity we're going to pursue, there has to be someone who's responsible for that. So there has to be some sort of like, I don't know, chief platform officer, or someone whose job is to evangelize and frankly, like make sure that the platform initiative gets executed. And so again, one of the things I learned at Intuit is if you don't do that, and they certainly had issues with this, it's basically very easy for people to like, okay, we'll try platform a little bit, but platforms are hard, right? Turning a product into a platform is a little bit difficult. we'll just go back to our day jobs, right? I mean, we have like products to sell, we have our normal incentives. So if there's not a very clear like leader in the organization who basically says we need to push this like into, and by the way, initially, like as you're building the platform, it's not obvious that it pays off like immediately, right? So it's very easy for people to just run back to doing products, unless you have someone who basically says, listen, I'm going to compensate you, or you need to absolutely do these features. So I think having some sort of instilling some consistency and having like a leader or a team that basically just like brings everything together within the organization is very important.
So basically the same as any change and any transformation kind of initiative of having the clear stakeholders and the mandate and the plan itself to follow through and all, and the KPIs per se.
Exactly. So I think that what I would say is like this one's particularly hard because it's going to be, again, product is very different from platform. So platform KPIs are quite different. The payoff is not going to be as obvious. Again, if you're selling a product, if you're doing well selling a product, you're like, why am I doing a platform? I can sell like 3 more copies of the product tomorrow, right? Like, what the hell are we doing here? And the point is like, no, it's going to pay off like in ways, by the way, sometimes it's not that you're going to get additional revenues immediately, but it's going to make your product more defensible. And you don't see that, like, it's very hard to compensate people on that because you can't really measure that immediately, but it certainly helps in the long run. The other problem with this is becomes like once you open up to third parties, and in particular, we talked about third parties that offer competing features. There's going to be people in the organization that absolutely hate this, right? In particular, the people whose job it is to maintain or to build the features that now you're inviting third parties to compete with. So those people are going to say like, what the hell? Like, I'm working really hard here, and you're just making it easier for outsiders to come in and compete with me. And again, you have to embrace that. You have to figure out a way to resolve that conflict internally. Again, this is kind of stuff like I would not have known because I don't run an organization, but I saw this at Intuit, and it wasn't easy.
And also, if you said just open to third party and then you just wait, I don't think that happened. It's not they're not gonna come, counting. You know what I mean? You have to do something to make the thoughts happen and the revenue happen. Because when you sell a product, easy, you have immediate satisfaction where you say, right, it's under your control to sell something. I have a sales revenue. That's a KPI. Platform is different. You can't really directly control.
Right. I mean, it's basically you're still selling, but you're selling like you're not selling. It's a bit like the term for this that platforms use it's called evangelizing. So you're saying, hey, third party. I'm not saying here's a product. It's more like here's an opportunity for you to come onto my platform and to sell to my customers. So it is quite different, right? Like you have to convince them that there's basically like your product is a great business opportunity for them.
I guess there are times when it is a bit easier because you have customers who actually really want all this functionality. They want this thing, they want that thing, and you can't possibly provide it all yourself. And then you can say to these third parties, oh, can you offer this? Can you offer that? And that's, I guess, the easiest case. So there's more like complementary add-ons, which customers are already demanding. They want these new features, and the company internally cannot offer all those features straight away. But if it opens up to third parties, it can. So, I think take the example of Zoom or something, right? I'm sure they have many, many requests for different features to build on top of Zoom. It's just maybe easier in a way for them to open that up to third parties to build.
Actually, that's a good point then. If you are a product business and you're having all these customer requests in terms of developing all this thing that you just think that, oh my God, I'm just the product head is like having a headache looking at all this customization. Let's make this a platform. Let's open it up and get people to develop, all this add-on and customization for our customer. That could be a good way to sense if you have a potential, platform business model.
Well, actually, there's one better way, and it's basically when the third parties are banging on your door. It's like, please let us in. So this is like the Apple example. It's like, please, like, let us develop apps for the iPhone. And initially, Apple was like, no. It's like, no. And it's like, okay, fine. Like then like if the third parties are coming begging to sell to your customers, then you have a platform.
I'm beginning to think that this whole platform thing is that you are actually becoming like an affiliate marketing kind of a revenue and partner and channels, in some way. That's what you're aggregating. So coming up in our next video, we will share another method to move from product to platform, which is all about connecting your customers. And if you know of someone who need to hear this, please share this with them and be sure to follow, subscribe or like, and send us your questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.